A friend of Robert Cialdini's had just opened an Indian jewelry store in Arizona, and she was frustrated. She had a batch of turquoise pieces that would not sell. They were good stones, priced fairly, displayed prominently, right in the center of the store where tourists could not miss them. Her staff pushed them. Nothing worked. So before leaving on a buying trip, she scribbled a note to her head saleswoman. Everything in this display case, price times 1/2. Move it out, even at a loss. When she came back, every piece was gone. She was not surprised that they had sold. She was surprised when she learned why. Her employee had misread the sloppy handwriting. Instead of having the price, she had doubled it. And at twice the price, the turquoise that nobody wanted became the turquoise that everybody wanted. Think about what actually happened there. The stones did not change. The lighting did not change. The salespeople did not change. What changed was a single number, and that number activated a rule that lives quietly in almost every one of us: expensive equals good. The tourists browsing that shop were not stupid. They simply did not know enough about turquoise to judge it on its merits, so they reached for a shortcut, and the shortcut betrayed them. That story opens one of the most widely read books ever written about human behavior, and it does something clever. It does not begin by telling you how to persuade other people. It begins by showing you how easily you can be persuaded and how little you will notice it happening. That is the real subject of the book. Not tricks. Machinery. The automatic, pre-installed machinery of the human mind, the shortcuts we all run on, and the small group of people who have learned exactly which buttons to press. Today we are talking about influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert B. Cialdini. It is a book about why you say yes when you meant to say no, and what you can do about it. Robert Cialdini is a social psychologist. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin in 1967, his doctorate in social psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1970. Then did postdoctoral training at Columbia University before joining Arizona State University as an assistant professor in 1971. He spent his career there and is now Regents Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Marketing. He has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences and to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, served as president of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, holds honorary doctorates. And in 2019, Arizona State named a behavioral research laboratory after him. He also runs a consulting firm, Influence at Work, and wrote a companion book called Persuasion in 2016. That is the resume of a mainstream academic. What makes influence unusual is that Cialdini did not write it from inside the university. He had a diagnosis of his own problem. The people who are genuinely world-class at getting other people to comply do not work in psychology labs. They work in car dealerships and fundraising offices and advertising agencies and recruitment centers. They run experiments constantly on real people with real money on the line, and they keep whatever works and discard whatever doesn't. Their knowledge was empirical, but it was not written down anywhere he could read it. So he went undercover. Over a period of about 3 years, he enrolled in sales training programs, took jobs, sat through fundraising seminars, and worked inside advertising operations, watching from the inside how professionals actually get people to say yes. He calls these people compliance professionals, and he says it without contempt. Then he took what he observed in the field and matched it against what the controlled experiments showed. The book is that combination, street-level observation checked against laboratory evidence. Influence was first published in 1984 by William Morrow in New York, a little over 300 pages. A paperback followed the next year, and starting in 1985, Cialdini also maintained a parallel classroom textbook version called Influence, Science and Practice, which ran through multiple editions alongside the trade book. A revised trade edition appeared in the mid-2000s. Then in 2021, Harper Business published Influence, New and Expanded, a substantially larger book, adding new research, new stories, applications to the online and digital world that did not exist in 1984, and one additional universal principle. The expansion added roughly 220 pages. The book has a stated dual purpose, and the second half of it matters more than most readers give it credit for. The first purpose is to explain why people comply. The second is to teach you to recognize when these triggers are being fired at you dishonestly, and to defend yourself. Cialdini's term for the principles is telling. He calls them weapons of influence. A weapon is not evil. It is a tool with a direction, and the question is who is holding it and where it is pointed. Before any of the specific principles, Cialdini has to establish the foundation, and the foundation is the least flattering idea in the book. Much of the time, we are not thinking. He borrows an image from animal behavior. A mother turkey is a devoted parent, but her devotion is triggered almost entirely by one thing, the cheep cheep sound a chick makes. Play a recording of that sound from a stuffed polecat, a natural enemy she would otherwise attack on sight, and she will gather it under her and mother it. Turn the recording off and she attacks it again. Ethologists call these fixed action patterns. A single trigger feature sets off a whole complicated sequence of behavior, reliably, mechanically, whether or not it makes sense in that particular case. Cialdini's argument is that human beings run similar programs. Not identical, not as rigid, but recognizably the same shape. He calls it click whirr. Something in the situation clicks, and a tape of pre-recorded behavior whirs into motion. Expensive equals good. That is a click whirr. It is usually right, which is exactly why it survives, and it is catastrophically wrong in a jewelry store full of tourists who cannot evaluate turquoise. His favorite laboratory demonstration of this is beautifully small. A researcher approaches people waiting to use a library photocopier and asks to cut in line. When she gives no reason at all, about 60% let her in. When she gives a real reason, that she is in a rush, compliance jumps to about 94%. That is unsurprising. The interesting condition is the third one, where she gives a reason that is not a reason at all. May I use the machine, because I have to make some copies. Everyone in that line has to make copies. It is pure noise. And compliance stays up around 93%. The word because triggered the tape. Nobody stopped to evaluate what followed it. He is careful about why this happens, and this is where the book earns its seriousness. He does not say we are lazy or foolish. He says we live in an environment of overwhelming complexity and information overload, one that has changed far faster than our decision-making equipment has. Nobody can analyze every feature of every situation they encounter in a day. Shortcuts are not a bug. They are an adaptation, and mostly they are efficient and correct. The cost of that efficiency is that anyone who understands the shortcuts can counterfeit the trigger. Cialdini compares them to a jiu-jitsu practitioner who does not supply the force that defeats you. They supply a small nudge and let your own weight and momentum do the work. He also introduces a background effect that amplifies everything else, the contrast principle. We do not judge things absolutely, we judge them against whatever came just before. Put your hands in hot and cold water, then plunge both into lukewarm, and the same bucket feels like two different temperatures. Clothing salespeople learn to sell the suit first and the sweater second, because a $95 sweater feels modest right after a $500 purchase and expensive on its own. Real estate agents have been known to keep a couple of overpriced, run-down properties on the books, not to sell them, but to show them first so the real listings look like discoveries. Nothing about the second item changed. Only its neighbor changed. With that foundation laid, the book walks through the principles one at a time. Each chapter follows the same architecture. Here is the principle. Here is why it exists and why it is usually adaptive. Here is how professionals weaponize it, and here is how you defend yourself. The first principle is reciprocation, the rule that we should try to repay what another person has given us. Cialdini argues this is close to a human universal, present in every human society that has been studied, and for a good reason. It made trade, gift-giving, mutual aid, and division of labor possible among people who were not kin. A society whose members feel obliged to repay can extend credit to each other. That is an enormous evolutionary advantage. The rule is trained into us so deeply that failing to reciprocate carries real social stigma. Nobody wants to be the moocher. The exploit is obvious once you see it. If the rule fires automatically, then an uninvited gift can create an obligation you never agreed to take on. The person who gives first controls what comes back. The classic experiment here is Dennis Reagan's. A subject works alongside a Confederate on a task. In one condition, the Confederate steps out during a break and returns with 2 Cokes, one for himself and one for the subject, unasked. Later, he asks the subject to buy raffle tickets. Subjects who got the free Coke bought roughly twice as many tickets. The kicker is that whether the subject liked the Confederate barely mattered in the gift condition. Normally liking predicts helping. The obligation was strong enough to override it. And the tickets cost far more than the Coke, meaning the Confederate came out well ahead on the exchange. Cialdini's field examples are everywhere once you look. The Hare Krishna Society revived its fundraising by pressing a flower into a traveler's hand before asking for a donation, refusing to take it back, so the traveler either donated or walked away carrying an unwanted flower and a bad feeling. Free samples in supermarkets are not primarily about tasting the product. Free inspections, free consultations, free gifts in the mail from charities with the reply envelope, all the same architecture. He describes watching sales operations built entirely on getting a product into the home first, no obligation, and letting the rule do the rest. There is a second, subtler form, reciprocal concessions, also called rejection then retreat, or the door-in-the-face technique. If you make a large request I refuse, then retreat to a smaller one, my sense of obligation to reciprocate your concession pushes me toward yes. Cialdini opens that section with a Boy Scout who asked him to buy $5 circus tickets. He said no. The boy immediately offered $1 chocolate bars instead. He bought 2, and then stood there realizing he did not even like chocolate. In his formal test of it, students asked to commit to 2 years of volunteer counseling almost all refused, but when the researcher then downshifted to a single afternoon trip to the zoo, acceptance roughly tripled compared to asking for the zoo trip alone. And notably, the people who agreed after the retreat felt more responsible for the outcome and were more likely to actually show up. The technique does not just produce compliance, it produces satisfaction with the deal. The defense is not to refuse all gifts. That would leave you hard, isolated, and honestly worse off. Cialdini's advice is a redefinition. Accept genuine offers graciously, but the instant you recognize that a gift is a compliance device rather than a favor, relabel it in your own mind. It is not a gift. It is a sales tactic. And the reciprocity rule says you owe favors for favors, not favors for sales tactics. The second principle is our nearly obsessive desire to be, and his most sobering example is the Chinese-run prisoner of war camps that held American soldiers during the Korean War. The captors used almost no brutality in their political program. Instead, they used essay contests and small statements, asking a prisoner to write or say something mildly agreeable, that the United States is not perfect, that unemployment exists there. Trivial. Then those statements were broadcast, published, discussed. The man had said it, publicly, in his own handwriting without being tortured into it. From there the pressure to remain consistent did work that force could not. The commercial versions are more mundane and just as effective. Sales operations that have prospects fill out the paperwork themselves rather than having the agent do it. Contests that ask entrants to write short testimonial essays about why they love a product. And the lowball technique, which Cialdini observed inside a car dealership, offer a price a few $100s below competitors, get the customer to commit, arrange financing, let them drive it, tell friends, build up all the personal supports for the decision, and then discover the error that removes the advantage. A remarkable number of people buy anyway, because by then the decision is standing on its own legs. He also describes toy manufacturers advertising a special toy heavily before the holidays while deliberately undersupplying stores, so parents who promise that specific toy have to buy substitutes at the time, then come back for the original when supply returns in January. The defense here is more delicate because you cannot simply decide to stop valuing consistency. Cialdini's suggestion is to listen for 2 internal signals. One is the stomach signal, the queasiness that arrives when you know you are being pushed toward a yes you do not want but feel trapped by something you already said. The other is the heart of hearts signal, for cases where the trap is subtler, where you have talked yourself into it. The question he offers is, knowing what I know now, if I could go back in time, would I make the same commitment? If the honest answer is no, then continuing is not integrity, it is just being played by your own past self. The third principle is that we determine what is correct by finding out what other people think is correct. This holds most strongly for behavior. If a lot of people are doing something, we take it as evidence that it is the sensible thing to do. It is a decent rule. Following the crowd is usually less error-prone than going it alone, and it saves enormous effort. But it has two failure conditions, and Cialdini identifies both with precision. Social proof exerts its greatest power when we are uncertain, when the situation is ambiguous and we do not know what to do. And it is strongest when the people we are observing are similar to us. Canned laughter is the everyday case. Almost everyone says they hate it. Studies nonetheless find that it makes audiences laugh more and rate material as funnier, and it works even when the laughter is transparently artificial. Producers know this. The evidence is in their behavior, not their statements. The same logic explains bartenders who seed the tip jar with their own bills at the start of a shift, and advertising that leans on fastest growing and best-selling rather than on any claim about the product itself. The dark version is the bystander effect. Cialdini uses the Kitty Genovese case, the 1964 New York murder famously reported as having been witnessed by dozens of neighbors who did nothing. It is worth saying plainly that later journalism and scholarship have substantially challenged the details of that original newspaper account, and Cialdini in later editions treats it with more care. But the underlying research by Bibb Latané and John Darley has held up well, and is the real point. In an emergency, more bystanders can mean less help, for two reasons working together. Responsibility is diffused, so no individual feels it is their job. And more importantly, an ambiguous emergency gets read socially. Everyone glances around, sees other people standing calm and composed, and concludes nothing serious is happening. Each person's attempt to appear composed becomes evidence for everyone else that composure is warranted. Cialdini calls it pluralistic ignorance, and it means a crowd of concerned people can collectively decide, wrongly, that nothing is wrong. From this he draws the single most practically useful piece of advice in the whole book. If you are ever in trouble in a crowd, do not scream for help in general. Isolate one individual. Look directly at them, point, and address them specifically. You, in the blue jacket, I need help, call an ambulance. He then decomposes liking into its ingredients. Physical attractiveness produces a halo effect, where a single good trait spills over into unrelated judgments about talent, honesty, and intelligence, and studies in hiring and even in courtrooms find measurable advantages. Similarity matters enormously, and it can be manufactured cheaply. Shared background, shared interests, shared clothing, mirrored posture, and speech. Compliments work, and they work embarrassingly well, even when we suspect the flatterer has something to gain. Familiarity built through repeated contact increases liking, which is why so much advertising is about mere exposure rather than argument. Cialdini adds an important qualification about contact, drawn from research on school desegregation and from Muzaffar Sharif's summer camp studies. Contact alone does not reliably produce liking, and under competitive conditions it can make things worse. What works is cooperation toward shared goals. Sharif's feuding groups of boys were only reconciled when circumstances forced them to solve problems together. Elliot Aronson's Jigsaw Classroom applies the same logic deliberately, structuring lessons so that students must depend on one another to succeed. This is also why the good cop bad cop routine works, and why a salesperson will theatrically fight the manager on your behalf. They have made themselves your teammate against a common adversary. Finally, there is association, the simple conditioning by which we come to like whatever is linked to good things and dislike whatever is linked to bad ones. Weather forecasters get hate mail about the weather. Cialdini describes the food and drink effect, where positions presented while people are eating something pleasant become more agreeable. Sports fandom lives here too, in the way we say we won when we did nothing of the kind, borrowing status from a connection. His example of liking pushed to its professional limit is Joe Girard, listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's greatest car salesman, who mailed every one of his thousands of customers a card every single month. The message never varied in substance. It said, in effect, "I like you." And it worked, even though recipients knew it was mass-produced. The defense is unusual, and I think it is the smartest one in the book. Cialdini says do not try to monitor all the ingredients, because there are too many and they operate below awareness. Monitor the output instead. Pay attention only to one thing, whether you have come to like this person more and faster than the circumstances warrant. That specific feeling of surprising warmth toward a stranger who is about to ask you for something is the alarm. When it goes off, mentally separate the person from the deal and evaluate the deal on its own terms. The fifth principle is deference to legitimate authority. We are trained from childhood that obedience to proper authority is right, and in a complex society, this is largely correct, since genuine experts usually do know more than we do. The trouble is that the response becomes automatic, and once automatic, it can be triggered by the symbols of authority rather than its substance. The heaviest evidence is Stanley Milgram's obedience research at Yale in the 1960s, in which ordinary volunteers, instructed by a calm experimenter in a lab coat, continued delivering what they believed were escalating and dangerous electric shocks to a protesting man. Roughly 2/3 went all the way to the maximum. Milgram's work has been criticized on ethical grounds and re-examined methodologically in the decades since, and it is right to hold the numbers loosely. But the core observation, that ordinary people will do extraordinary things when a legitimate-seeming authority takes responsibility, has been replicated in various forms and remains one of the most important findings in social psychology. Cialdini's contribution is to show the same effect in ordinary institutions. He discusses research in hospitals where nurses followed a physician's instruction that was clearly wrong. In one widely cited case, a doctor's written order for ear drops was abbreviated in a way that read as "place in our ear," and the nurse, following it literally, administered ear drops rectally for an earache. Neither the nurse nor the patient questioned it. The instruction was absurd, but it came from a doctor, and the doctor's authority substituted for the patient's and the nurse's own judgment. He then identifies the symbols that trigger the response without any of the substance behind them. Titles are the cheapest, and they are frequently borrowed rather than earned. Clothing is powerful, and studies show people will follow a jaywalker in a business suit at markedly higher rates than the same person in casual clothes, and comply with odd instructions from a man in a security uniform. Trappings, meaning cars, offices, watches, and other markers of status, do similar work. Advertising has exploited this for decades by hiring actors who played doctors on television to endorse products, borrowing an authority that was fictional to begin with. The defense is 2 questions, and I find them genuinely useful. First, is this authority truly an expert on this specific question? Titles travel badly across domains, and a great deal of persuasion depends on us not noticing that the expert's expertise is in a neighboring field, or in nothing at all. Second, and more important, how truthful can I expect this expert to be here? A real expert with a stake in my decision is still an interested party. Cialdini notes that the most disarming move a persuader can make is to volunteer a small piece of evidence against their own interest, because admitting a minor flaw purchases credibility for the major claim that follows. Restaurant servers who steer you away from one dish become trusted advisors on the wine list. The 6th principle is that opportunities seem more valuable when their availability is limited. Cialdini gives it 2 engines. The first is a simple heuristic. Things that are difficult to get are typically better than things that are easy to get, so availability serves as a quick proxy for quality. That is often true, and it is often enough true that we stop checking. The second engine is more forceful. Psychological reactance, a theory developed by Jack Brem, holds that when our freedom to have something is restricted, we want it more, and we act to reclaim it. The response shows up early. 2-year-olds shown 2 equally attractive toys, one of them behind a transparent barrier, make straight for the blocked one. It shows up again in adolescence, and it shows up in adult life as the Romeo and Juliet effect, in which parental interference in a young relationship correlates with intensified attachment. The evidence Cialdini assembles is consistent and slightly funny. In a study of a phosphate detergent ban in Dade County, Florida, residents came to rate phosphate detergents as gentler, more effective, and better at everything, including whitening, than residents of a comparable area where the products were still available. The soap did not improve. It became forbidden. Information behaves the same way. Studies find that hearing a message has been censored can make people more sympathetic to its position, sometimes without their ever having heard the message itself. That is a genuinely important point for anyone thinking about how to handle bad ideas in public. The most instructive finding is the cookie jar experiment by Whirr and colleagues. Participants rated cookies from a jar containing 10 or from a jar containing 2. The scarce cookies were rated more desirable. Then the researchers added conditions. Cookies that started abundant and became scarce were rated higher than cookies that had been scarce all along. And cookies that became scarce because other people had taken them were rated highest of all. 2 lessons fall out of that. New scarcity is more powerful than constant scarcity, which is why Cialdini connects this to revolutions, noting the pattern identified by historians in which uprisings tend to follow a period of improving conditions abruptly reversed, rather than sustained deprivation. And social competition for a scarce resource is the strongest form of all, which is precisely what auctions, bidding wars, and countdown timers with other shoppers viewing this item are engineered to produce. The commercial tactics follow directly: limited number, only 3 left in stock, and deadline, offer ends tonight. Cialdini describes watching a used car dealer schedule multiple interested buyers for the same appointment slot, so each one arrives to find competitors circling the vehicle. The defense here is different from the others, because scarcity produces physical arousal. Your pulse goes up, focus narrows, and careful thinking becomes harder exactly when you need it. So step 1 is to use the arousal itself as a cue, to treat that surge of urgency as a signal to stop rather than to move. Step 2 is a question that cuts through most of it: why do I want this thing? If you want it because of what it does, for its function, its taste, its use, then scarcity is close to irrelevant to your decision, since a rare cookie does not taste better than a common one. If you want it purely for the having, because it will be gone and someone else will get it, then let scarcity guide you on price and availability. But do not let the joy of owning something rare masquerade as the pleasure of using something good. The 2021 Expanded Edition adds a 7th principle: unity. It is not the same as liking or similarity. Liking is about the qualities I share with you. Unity is about shared identity, the categories in which we are not merely alike but are the same, where the boundary between me and you blurs into a we. Family and kinship sit at the center of it, and place does too: region, hometown, country. Cialdini argues that persuasion, which invokes genuine shared identity, has a force that persuasion invoking mere similarity does not, because we treat the interests of the in-group as partly our own interests. He also identifies acting together as a route to unity, in synchronized movement, in music, in shared ritual, and in co-creation, where inviting someone to help build a thing makes them an owner of it. Anyone who has watched a company ask customers to vote on the next feature has watched this operating. Now the honest part. This book was written in 1984, and it draws on a body of social psychology research that has since been through a difficult reckoning. Over the past 15 years, the field has confronted a replication crisis, and a number of findings that once circulated as settled facts have turned out to be smaller than reported, fragile across contexts, or, in some cases, unreproducible. Some of the studies and influence come from that era and that tradition. Milgram's work carries well-documented ethical and methodological criticism. The Kitty Genovese narrative was substantially wrong as originally reported. Certain effects have shrunk under scrutiny. I do not think this sinks the book, and here is why. The 7 principles are not exotic laboratory curiosities. They are supported by converging evidence from many independent lines, including field experiments with real consequences, and by the direct commercial behavior of people who lose money when they are wrong. When Cialdini watched sales organizations converge on the same techniques he was measuring in the lab, that convergence is itself evidence of a robust kind. What I would hold loosely is any single dramatic study or specific percentage. What I would hold firmly is the structure. And to his credit, Cialdini has updated the book across editions rather than freezing it. The other criticism worth naming is the ethical one. The book was written as a consumer defense manual and has been read, overwhelmingly, as a manual for practitioners. Cialdini clearly anticipated this, and in later editions he pushes harder on the argument that dishonest use of these principles is bad business, not just bad ethics, because manufactured triggers eventually get detected and the detection poisons the relationship. That is a decent argument. It is also, I notice, itself an appeal to self-interest, which tells you something about how hard it is to keep a tool pointed in the direction you intended. The first takeaway is the frame, and it matters more than any individual principle. You do not make most of your decisions by reasoning. You make them by running shortcuts, and the shortcuts are usually right, which is what makes them dangerous. Anyone who understands the shortcut can counterfeit its trigger and get the response without supplying the substance that normally earns it. The second is the list itself, worth committing to memory. Reciprocation, because we repay what we receive. Commitment and consistency, because we align with what we have already done. Social proof, because we look to others when we are uncertain. Liking, because we say yes to people we like. Authority, because we defer to expertise and to its symbols. Scarcity, because we want what is disappearing. And unity, because we favor those who share our identity. The third is that the defenses are specific, not general. There is no single skill called resisting persuasion. Against reciprocity, relabel a tactic as a tactic and feel no debt. Against consistency, ask whether you would make the same commitment again knowing what you now know. Against social proof, check the underlying evidence and watch for crowds copying crowds. Against liking, monitor for warmth that outruns the relationship. Against authority, ask whether the expertise is real and whether the expert is disinterested. Against scarcity, notice the arousal and ask whether you want the thing or want the winning. The fourth is that these principles are not villains. They exist because they generally work. The correct posture is not permanent suspicion, which is exhausting and makes you worse at life. It is a tripwire that goes off in the narrow case where the trigger has been faked. Cialdini's argument is that we should be willing to fight back specifically against counterfeit triggers, precisely in order to keep the genuine ones useful. And the fifth, which is practical if you are on the persuading side, every one of these principles has an honest version. You can create genuine value before asking for anything. You can honor real commitments. You can show real evidence of what others actually do. You can build real relationships. You can be a real expert about real limits. You can be honest about genuine scarcity. The honest version is slower, and it is the only one that compounds. What stays with me about this book is the turkey. A mother turkey will mother a stuffed predator if it makes the right sound, and attack it the moment the sound stops. We read that and feel comfortably superior, and then we read 300 pages about ourselves, and the feeling wears off. The tourists doubled the price and reached for their wallets. The prisoners wrote a sentence and lost a piece of themselves. The volunteers turned the dial because a man in a lab coat said the experiment requires that you continue. The value of influence is not that it makes you immune. It does not. Cialdini is clear that he wrote it in the first place because he was, in his own description, a lifelong sucker, someone who kept buying magazine subscriptions and gala ball tickets he did not want, and that the book began as an attempt to understand what kept happening to him. That admission is the most credible thing in it. The principles work on the person who wrote the book about them. What it gives you instead is a vocabulary and a set of tripwires. Once you have the words, you start to notice. You notice the free sample and feel the small hook set. You notice yourself defending a decision because it was yours, not because it was good. You notice the countdown timer and feel your pulse respond to a number on a screen. Noticing does not stop the reaction, but it gives you a half second between the click and the whir, and a half second is where the whole of your autonomy lives. There is a larger point underneath, and I think it is the real reason this book has lasted 4 decades. Cialdini argues that these shortcuts are not going away and that they will get more important, not less, as the world becomes more complicated and information becomes more abundant. He was writing that in 1984. He now writes it about feeds and recommendations and systems built specifically to find and pull our levers at a scale no door-to-door salesman ever dreamed of. The environment that trains our shortcuts is being engineered by people who profit from them. That makes the defensive half of this book, the half most readers skim, the half that matters most. So read it for the mechanics, but keep the ethics. The most useful question the book leaves you with is not how do I get people to say yes. It is a quieter one, which you can ask about your own behavior as easily as anyone else's. When I got that yes, did I earn it, or did I just find the button?